Hello, my name is Jacqueline Schramm. I'm an anthropologist with Urban Anthropology, Inc. I'm also an Ojibwe. Today we'll be talking about urban Indians. As your anthropologist pointed out, urban Indians live in cities throughout the Americas, but we will be focusing on Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm right now standing in front of the Congregation of the Great Spirit and the Siginoc Center, places where Milwaukee Native people come for social and spiritual guidance. But before we discuss activities of current urban Indians, let's go back in time and learn how the natives lived in Wisconsin many years ago. American Indians are the only indigenous people who live on the American hemisphere. The word indigenous means that they were the first people here. Many scientists think that American Indians came to the Americas between 10,000 and 15,000 years ago across the Bering Strait. Back in time, much of the earth was covered by glaciers. When the water was locked up in ice, the oceans were lower. This made it possible for people to walk on land that is underwater now. Most American Indian tribes have their own beliefs about their beginnings. Many American Indian people believe that they have been here in America since the beginning of time. Eventually, indigenous people lived all over the Americas. In the area we know as the United States now, there were and still are more than 500 different nations. Some people think there may have been as many as 10 million indigenous people in the Americas when Columbus arrived here. Each nation had its own language, religion, and cultural practices. Tribes did not stay put though. They moved about depending on where they could get food and which other tribes were their friends or enemies. One major group that came to Wisconsin was the Anishinaabe, who moved here from the East Coast. Their elders were told that the Europeans were coming and that they should move to a place where food grew on water. Many of the Anishinaabe left the East and traveled by canoe following the St. Lawrence River. Some of the Anishinaabe stayed at places along the way. My group, the Ojibwe, stayed along the Winnipeg River. When others reached Michigan, the Anishinaabe divided up into three groups we know today as the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa. This was around the 15th century. The food they found on the water was wild rice. This picture is of a wigwam, which is the kind of house the Anishinaabe lived in. They call this kind of house a wigwam because it is made of the same material as canoes, which is birch bark. The word for birch bark in Ojibwe is wigwas. Now I bet that you can tell why these houses are called wigwams. The other major Indian groups also came from the east, as their land was taken away by European American settlers. One of these groups was the Oneida. Here's an Oneida doll made of corn husks. You'll notice that she wears a traditional outfit of purple, much like the Oneida outfits you see today at powwows. Early in Milwaukee, these tribes lived in villages of less than 500 people, but there were many of these little villages. The area we call Milwaukee today was mainly a wetland and offered a lot of food choices, such as ducks, deer, many kinds of fish, and of course, wild rice. And the villagers also grew crops like corn, beans, squash, and melons. When the Europeans came to settle in Wisconsin, they traded with the American Indian tribes for beaver skins, so they could make men's hats that were very fashionable at the time. Eventually, there weren't enough beavers for the hats, and the white settlers also wanted more land. So most of the American Indians were forced by the U.S. government to give up their land and go live on smaller pieces of land called reservations. This included most of those Indians who lived in the Milwaukee area. The United States government wanted the American Indians to become farmers, but the land they were allowed to keep for themselves was not always good for farming, and the U.S. government began to forbid use of the languages, cultures, and religions of American Indians. They wanted Indians to be more like the European Americans. The government made it illegal for Indians to practice their traditional religions. The hardest thing for American Indian families was what happened to their children. The government took the children away from the families and put them in boarding schools. A boarding school is a place where the children stayed all the time and didn't get to go home. Most of the time, these schools were miles and sometimes entire states away from the children's homes. In the schools, the boys were taught trades and the girls were taught how to sew and clean so they could work as maids in hotels and for white families. The children had to work half of the day farming, cleaning, and doing other hard work. And they were punished if they spoke their language. Many didn't go home for years. When they finally did go home, some could not talk to their parents anymore because their parents spoke their tribal language and they spoke only English. Some American Indian families moved to Milwaukee in the early 20th century to keep their children from being taken away to boarding school. Also, on the reservations, there weren't many jobs. And remember I told you that some of the land on the reservations was not good for farming? This also led to a number of Indian families coming to Milwaukee to get other jobs. What the government didn't know would happen in boarding schools is that American Indians would find things in common while in the schools. People from many different tribes saw that the government was trying to keep all Indian people from speaking their languages and from continuing their cultural practices. It made them strong and caused them to come together as Indians to get things done in a way they couldn't if they just did things as a tribe. They started to help each other. They started thinking about the rights of American Indian people, no matter where they lived. Many of the children who went to boarding schools became politically active when they were adults, and they would band together to ask the government to keep their promises to Indian people. In the 1950s, the U.S. government thought it was time for all American Indians to move off reservations and live more like European Americans. They made laws to terminate reservations, to put them to an end. Lots of posters were sent to reservations to try to convince American Indian families to move to cities. This poster is for Denver. There were posters for Milwaukee like this too. Hundreds of people moved from the reservations to Milwaukee at this time, but lots of people still traveled back and forth to the reservation on weekends or in the summer. This is how the Native people returned to the Milwaukee area after they had been forced on the reservations. In a few minutes, you will hear from many of the Milwaukee natives about their activities in Milwaukee. But first, it's time to return to your instructor and work on the questions that were set up for you.
In the city, Indians from various nations would have more opportunities to communicate with diverse populations. Anthropologists and native scholars have long pointed out the ways that American Indians experience connections, how Indian ways focus on the harmony among relationships rather than the distinctions.
Every day we acknowledge our Creator. Every morning when we say our prayers, we acknowledge our grandmothers who are in the moon and our grandfathers and brothers and sisters who are part of this earth. And so we stay connected that way by honoring all of our relatives every morning and throughout the whole day. We are all connected to the earth and to the sky and to the waters, to the animals and plants, that we all share a bond together, and so we honor everything every morning by saying our prayers and acknowledging, saying our thank yous to everything that is, so that we can maintain ourselves and our families here.
The practice of recognizing connections was stimulated in the city when Native peoples sought associations with other Indians, often from different nations.
In the old times, we would gather together in the summer to do our gathering and our fishing and our hunting. And then when it came winter, they break up into smaller bands. Well, the same thing happens in the cities. As the different people come into the cities, they find places where they can gather together. And one of the things they do when they gather together is they'll have the potluck dinner or the potlatch.
I think there's a sense of bonding of a lot of the Indian community members that are here, whether they came from the same nation or not. There's a number of us that have grown up together and gone to high school together, got to know one another later on as adults.
The Indian population in Milwaukee never comprised more than 2% of the city's population. At times, this bonding became necessary for survival of the group.
Living in an urban community, tribal centrism does not work in that we need to keep together as an intertribal entity in order to get funding for Indian urban programs. And a lot of times the government agencies will say, well, what tribe are you with? What tribe are you with? Thinking of government-to-government relationships instead of an intertribal urban Indian relationship. And our tribal centrism sometimes steps in that way, where we'll say, well, we're this tribe or that tribe, when we should actually be saying, well, we're urban Indians, and that's how we need to get more of the funding for our programs, such as Spotted Eagle High School and Indian Council of the Elderly.
In the city, Native people had more contact with individuals from non-Indian ethnic backgrounds. Some experienced the familiar racism they had known in rural areas, and some described more tolerance.
I feel now, where I'm working in the Indian school here, I feel valued. I feel like I have a lot to offer, and by the non-Native teachers as well, I just feel more respected, whereas I didn't feel that way up on the res. I just experienced more racism.
But most discussed common practices they recognized among their own nations and the groups they came to know in Milwaukee. Scholars of ethnic boundaries, such as Frederick Barth, usually document the ways cultural groups look for distinctions between themselves and others. But nearly all the Native people interviewed for the project focused on commonalities rather than differences.
I like the cultural diversity in Milwaukee, the different ethnic groups. There's a number of different American Indians from different nations across the United States and Canada that live in Milwaukee. But I also enjoy the Latino community members, Hmong Lao, African American, and like we have the different festivals, and that's interesting to learn more from the people that are from those cultures.
We honor the four colors, black, yellow, red, and white, and all of these colors come together as a human race. They all have their own ceremonies and their own spiritual ways, but there's always something there that links them together with another one.
I personally believe, that we are all related, and that like some of the biblical stories correspond or correlate really well with Native American stories, because the Native Americans have flood stories, and the Native American have twin stories, twin fighting, brothers, fighting. The same thing in Native stories, traditional oral tradition. There's the same kinds of stories, and so I really believe that we are all related.
The Native Americans use different herbs to smudge. The African people use different herbs to smudge. The Hispanic people use different herbs.
The Irish and the Indian people are very, very similar in that the Irish have their clan systems, so do we. The Irish built their forts in circular ways, so did we. The Gaelic people had an Earth Mother religion and a female-dominated society. Believe it or not, and our women are pretty strong also. Our language was ripped from us, and so was theirs.
Some of those who noted differences in practices of Milwaukee groups found ways to incorporate those differences into their own lives.
When I was on the reservation, living on the reservation, I had already toured in Europe with a Native musician a few times before I came down here to school. And so I was already going on my music career. It's just that it helped me to develop a few other things. Say, like if I was a painter, it gave me some extra colors to work with, as opposed to having maybe 3 or 4. And coming down here, I had like 7 or 8 to work with. And it's also good because I can go back to the reservation, and which I do every summer, and work with kids and music. And I have more to bring back now.
But nearly all the Native people interviewed stressed the value, in fact, the necessity of maintaining their own traditions. Keeping these beliefs and practices over the years often involved personal risks, until the passage of the American Indian Freedom of Religion Act in 1978, many Native practices were outlawed in the United States.
The importance of the Freedom of Religion Act was important to a lot of cultures in the United States, but for the American Indian people it was important for us because we were now allowed to assimilate the traditions and the ceremonies that a lot of people were continuing to do, and we didn't have to do those in hiding any longer. We could now bring those to the forefront and start teaching our children openly about their culture and traditions. It also allowed us to play medicine games in lacrosse, where lacrosse was actually an Ivy League game and could be played in that arena. When American Indian people played lacrosse, we had to do that out in the woods and hide out in the fields, because if they were caught playing lacrosse, we could be arrested because it was a medicine. It was a pagan ritual.
The efforts at de-Indianizing Wisconsin's indigenous people ultimately failed. If anything, cultural practices among Wisconsin's Indian nations have amplified over the years. Much of this revival has occurred in the city. Native practices, known as Indian life ways, are spiritually centered.
Most people go to church on Sunday, right? Sunday's their day to go to church. Well, for an Indian, every day is Sunday. I mean, we call it life ways. That's how we're supposed to act every day. You know, those things they teach you in church on Sunday, we're supposed to behave that way every day, because we don't know how long we're going to be on this earth.
According to some Native groups and individuals, the spiritual center of Indian life ways is incompatible with other religions. Among others, some Indian spiritual practices can blend with those of non-Native religions. Native people in Milwaukee today demonstrate their commitment to Indian life ways in all aspects of daily living. Practices range from language preservation to sweat lodges, to ghost dinners, to music, to dancing, to dress, to Indian gaming, to naming ceremonies, to food, to powwows.
There has been projected that by the middle of this century, when the elders die off, the fluent elders die off in many tribes, there'll be 5 languages that may survive that, 5 indigenous languages. I know Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, is one of them that will survive. And that's because of Canadian speakers, not American speakers, American Indian speakers.
A naming ceremony is a spiritual name that's given to Native people. Usually it's given through a dream from the Creator, from the spirit world, and what it is then, it's a spiritual name that is kind of a spirit helper, and it protects you and it guides you along your way of life. And so it's good to have an Indian name, and they say that when you cross over to the other side of the river that the Creator will call you by your Indian name, because that's how you're known from the spirit world. So that name was already, you know, chosen for you in the spirit world. It was just kind of, then you have to have the ceremony to get that name.
The drum, according to elders,
have told me and mentioned that was given us to unify our people, the Native people. And here in this city, it's a big help with all the other distractions. So it helps bring us together here in the city or wherever we're at. It was said this drum was given to us by Mother Nature, our Mother Earth, however you might call it.
Well, gambling was a way of life with Indian people all the time, even before Europeans came here. Whole villages would get together, one village with their medicine man, another village with their medicine man, and they would wager sometimes whole villages against whole villages on who was the stronger of the two. So they would do guessing games. Children's games were primarily guessing games and stuff like that. So gambling was a little bit of a way of life.
I've been going to powwows all my life. I have never seen a fight break out on a powwow grounds. It's a place where Indian people gather to sing and dance and get together. There's no alcohol allowed on the grounds. It's a lot different than people that go out on the weekends to different places to gather and have fun and do the same thing, sing and dance. But a lot of times in those kind of places, people end up with fights or whatever. I've been going to powwows all my life. I have never seen a fight break out on a powwow grounds.
And of course, there are the Indian art forms. American indigenous population has a long history of collective action and self-sufficiency. The contributions made by Native people to European Americans, either by coercion or choice, have been widely documented. These include the land we today call the United States, strategies for plant cultivation, the mainstays in the American diet, healing herbs, and the wilderness trails. What is not widely known is how much the indigenous Americans contributed to what would later become identified with European American ideals. For example, few people probably know the extent to which the authors of the United States Constitution borrowed major tenets from the Great Law of Peace developed by the Iroquois Confederacy. Today, representative democracy in the United States is a model for collective action. Scholars of early American history also point out the ways that immigrating Europeans emulated Indian dress, hairstyles, hunting strategies, music, and the strong, reserved personalities of the indigenous population to develop the collective idea of the American cowboy. More recently, many ecology activists in the United States have adopted the Indian model of safeguarding the connections in the natural environment. The practices associated with harmony and collective action, long linked with Indian life ways and emulated by others, would become most important to the Native people in adapting to life in cities. When Indians migrated to urban areas, they found few resources and had too few numbers to pressure political gatekeepers to expand these resources. They relied on their collective traditions. In Milwaukee, they strengthened their networks and developed organization after organization.
Well, when I came here in 1947, the only organizations they had here was the Consolidated Tribes of North America and the Chippewa Club. There was nothing else, just those two groups. But now I got all kinds of different organizations.
The urban Indians developed their own spiritual centers and found ways to incorporate their practices into Christian churches.
The role of Siganok Center, we actually have 4 areas: social justice, human concerns, language and culture, and spirituality. We're kind of like a locus for the Native churches here in Milwaukee, and we do bring in traditional spiritual leaders also to come and work with us.
Native people built a rich inventory of health programs. They developed 2 major schools in Milwaukee serving hundreds of Native children. The Indian Community School, serving K4 through 8 students, and the Spotted Eagle High School. The urban Indians also developed educational outreach programs in other schools.
The other thing too is that in the Milwaukee Public Schools there are concentrations of American Indian students, and now we're trying to address the needs of those children more specifically through some in-service training. And that's something that we're trying to move forward and be a little more proactive at. And then too, I think the American Indian Studies program at UWM has helped with that by bringing other people together.
They drew on their traditions and added leisure time activities.
But I know our student group is very active in trying to do events or do things together, and as part of that, they've done things like had beading sessions where we get together at a person's house and make something. Here at our office, we offered how to make shawls. Whatever we know or whatever, and we can pass on, like how to make a dream catcher or whatever. If students are interested in that, then we try to offer that to them. Getting together in those small groups is also social, and that's a cultural thing as well. And then having food or whatever are things that we always try to include in the things that we do.
They found ways to fund their own organizations through casinos. They created their own programs to assist Indian businesses, such as loan funds.
Our intent is to be the lender and prepare these businesses for the next level by being their lender for a short period of time. The program is designed to provide access to capital to business owners, people that are starting their own business or expanding their business in Wisconsin. This is the first program in the country that is going to serve Native entrepreneurs on a statewide basis.
Native people developed social services. And most significantly, more Indian activism movements grew out of urban linkages than had developed in the rural settlements. Some of the activism addressed specific urban issues. The American Indian Movement, or AIM, was founded in the Twin Cities to deal with law enforcement agencies, and chapters then spread to other cities. In 1971, the Milwaukee chapter of AIM occupied a vacant Coast Guard station on Lake Michigan and gradually turned it over to the growing Indian Community School. Even movements to effect change on or near rural settlements were founded in cities. The successful initiative to return the Menominee to its tribal status, called Drums, or the determination of rights and unity for Menominee shareholders, developed in Milwaukee and Chicago in the 1970s. When all of this is put together, the networks, the emulated practices, wealth of organizations, and the activism, it means added value to the city of Milwaukee.
Now it's time to hear a little bit about the contributions of urban Indians right here in Wisconsin.
The Indian community was asked to help the Milwaukee Public Museum develop the Tribute to Survival exhibit that's currently, I think it's on the second floor of the museum. Indian Summer Festivals, that's a group of American Indian people that came together to have a more positive representation of American Indian people and the accomplishments of the different peoples of the Americas.
The urban Indians have built successful businesses all over southeast Wisconsin.
First on the list is a guy by the name of Brian Holmes. Brian is the partner in two companies, Ojibwa Ready Mix and B&D Contractors. B&D Contractors installed all the seating in the new Miller Park Brewers Stadium. They also did rough carpentry work down at the Museum Edition downtown. Other examples of Indian-owned businesses in Milwaukee is Underground Pipeline, Inc. That's a New Berlin company owned by the Dretzka brothers. Also Howard Kingman, owner of Kingman Custom Contractors out in Oconomowoc. They do major remodels, new home building, and other construction projects for residences. And Great Lakes Contracting is a company down on the south side of Milwaukee. They do structural steel work.
Native people have contributed professionals to domains such as education, healthcare, the legal system, and human services.
We have doctors, we have nurses, we have technicians, so that presents a more positive front and a contemporary image of American Indian people versus a stereotypical image of American Indian people. We have architects too. We have several professors that work not only in American Indian Studies at UW-Milwaukee, but also in like the English department, social work, and things like that. So we're in the community making contributions both as individuals and as American Indian people.
Native people have built programs to serve the wider community.
This at one time was a very dangerous gang area. The Latin Kings and the Cobras were supposedly battling for this turf. And when I had heard that, I had no idea what they meant about battling for a turf. And then I started thinking, well, that must be some gunfire or something. And I'm not about that. And after about a week later, I called the guy up and I told him, I said, well, we will open up the program because it is a good program it gives the kids something to do besides roaming the streets and hanging out.
In addition, successfully run efforts such as the Potawatomi Casino contribute a vast inventory of resources to the wider community, both in terms of employment opportunities and in terms of direct grants to non-Indian organizations.
With the foundation, we are outreaching as best as we can to help eliminate poverty. In addition to the foundation giving money to charitable organizations, we also employ over 1,600 people in Milwaukee. Many of these people were W-2 recipients and were having a very hard time supporting their family. With the jobs they have been able to obtain through Potawatomi Bingo Casino, they are now enjoying not only a good wage, but also benefits.
The indigenous Wisconsin population, once removed from the area now known as Milwaukee, returned to the city by both coercion and choice. Lacking resources and political power, they drew on their own cultural practices to build new organizations, strategize to preserve their life ways, create linkages to other groups, lead causes, and support their own needs. While caring for their own community, they contributed cultural institutions, valuable enterprises, and funding streams into the wider Milwaukee community. The Native people accomplished this through the kind of collective action they drew from Indian life ways.